Welcome back again to Joe's Son of Boxing. I hope you're doing well. There was a press conference today to formally announce the Chris Eubank Jr. Liam Smith rematch, and it was all very civilized. Um, I suppose you could say if there wasn't a rematch clause that this fight wouldn't be going ahead because Liam Smith won the first fight so conclusively. The question would be, well, what do I need to fight him again for? I've smashed him up. I've got rid of him. Yeah, and I would go along with that. But there were a few things mentioned by Eubank that I don't think can be brushed aside. I think you have to at least consider them. And number one amongst those things is that he felt that he was winning the fight up to the point where he got knocked out, and he was saying that he was just coming into his own. Well, I think that's probably accurate. I mean, there was a 30-second burst in the third round where Eubank was just smashing into Smith. And fair play to Smith, he took it. I mean, he's a warrior. He's a tough guy. But you can't be taking too many of them over a 12-round fight. And it was still early in the fight. So I wouldn't dismiss Eubank's claims that he was showing something in that fight. And then he got tagged, he got caught. But ultimately, you have to say, but he got caught. Ultimately, he got knocked out. It was a legitimate defeat. And Eubank spent a lot of that press conference today saying, well, I wanted to carry on. He tried to sort of spin it so that the referee may have stepped in too quickly. And no one was buying that at all. And Liam Smith, you could see his reaction was almost a sort of, can I be bothered to even argue with this guy? People actually did watch that fight. They do know what happened. They watched it. They saw it. And Chris, being the warrior that he is, and he is a warrior. I mean, you can't deny that. Whatever you think of the guy, he fights. He comes to fight. He was saying, well, the people had paid to watch me take a beating. I should have been allowed to carry on. And he actually said to Liam Smith, you were denied the opportunity for a conclusive ending, to sort of smash me up, beat me up, and I may have been beaten up, and I was denied the right to fight back and grab victory from the jaws of defeat. Well, I think it was a conclusive ending anyway. Victor Loughran was the referee, and I think he stopped the fight perfectly. He gave Eubank every chance. If I was in Liam Smith's shoes, I'd have probably said something like, well, look, I didn't want to kill you, for Christ's sake. I was beating the living tar out of you. What do I want to kill you for? But Eubank, he's going to spin it. He's going to say, I was doing all right. I was, yeah. Well, yeah, you may have been doing all right, but how many fighters in the history of the sport were doing all right until they walked into that big shot? Quite a few, I think. So what we've got to talk about now is, what we'll consider now is, does Eubank have a chance to turn it round? Well, what went wrong in the first fight? First of all, I've got to mention this thing with Eubank and Roy Jones Jr. I don't like it. I don't think it's a good matchup. I've seen no evidence that Eubank Jr. has improved under Roy Jones Jr.'s tutelage. I think Jones, at his absolute peak, was a terrifying prospect, probably the closest I've ever seen in my lifetime to an unbeatable fighter. Although no fighter is unbeatable. But my God, he came close to it. He was astonishing. Just a freak of nature, a one-off athlete, really, who did everything wrong, nothing by the textbook, and yet, stood very good fighters on their head. Not to mention, not least of all, James Toney and Bernard Hopkins. Okay, he did fail at a drugs test, so that leaves a black mark over his legacy as far as I'm concerned, Jones. And in fact, only a couple of weeks ago, he lost to a 36-year-old debutant who I think was an MMA guy. So Jones still fighting at 54. It's very, very sad to see. Very sad to see. So I suppose you could say he's tarnished his, legacy in that way. But at his peak, he was almost just about untouchable. Brilliant fighter. But that's not to say he can train Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. has a very, very different style, a natural style. Is athletic, clearly, but in no way does he have anywhere near similar skills to Jones or a similar style to Jones. And I've seen no evidence that that matchup is working, it's paying dividends. And in that fight against Smith, there were moments when Eubank was almost doing there were sort of shades of a bad impression of Roy Jones, you know. But having said all that, surely the reason why Eubank got smashed up in the first fight was because of the weight. In the aborted Conor Benn fight, he was contracted at 1.5. He had to come down at 157, which I think is scandalous, very, very dangerous. When they said it, I thought it was very, very dangerous. And Chris Eubank Sr. made comments about that, saying that something along the lines of, I've already lost one son, I don't want to lose another one. That sounds melodramatic, or I don't know. I think boiling yourself down to 157 at that age, when you've actually spent a couple of years at 168, I didn't like the sound of that at all. And on the scales at 159, when he released a few photos of himself on the scales at 159, still with 2 pounds to lose, he looked horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Like he had an eating disorder, which I suppose in a sense he did. It's the equivalent of. And then that fight was aborted, so I assume he didn't put on too much weight, because the Liam Smith deal for the first fight happened, quite quickly. So I don't think Eubank would have put on much weight. He came in at 160, of course. Was it 160 fight, the first Liam Smith? Was it? There wasn't a catch weight, was it? No. But whatever the case, clearly boiling his body down, just as his trainer did, Jones Jr. did, when he moved up to fight John Ruiz and then came back to light heavy and was never, ever the same. It's like he wrecked his body, boiling it back down again. He fought Tarver the first time and it was a close fight, but he won. And in the second fight, he got completely ironed out and was never the same. Glenn Johnson smashed him up as well, knocked him out. So Jones wrecked his body with that whole weight thing, and he's not the first fighter to do that. And Eubank Jr., I think, has completely diminished his punch resistance by just starving himself. And there's no other way to put it. He starves himself. It's a very, very dangerous thing to do. They used to do this in Japan, some of the Korean fighters perhaps. Back in the 90s, a lot of these Japanese fighters would come in like painfully underweight and then rehydrate. I mean, I can't remember who exactly it was, but I can remember some of the Japanese fighters and the Korean fighters, having to be put on the scales by their trainers and looking, like death warmed up. And then by fight time, they'd fight for their lives, and they'd be throwing multiple punches. I mean, it's just I don't still to this day, I don't understand why that was allowed, or what type of training regime and dietary regime they were using. Of course, the weigh-ins were different. The weigh-ins used to be, different. Now it's, the day before the fight now, so you get that chance to replenish. But no, look, if you're messing around with weight, and if you're coming down too low in weight, and you're draining that fluid off the brain, and you're leaving you're draining the fluid out of the brain sits in this, if you can imagine, it sits in the skull, surrounded by fluid. If you're draining that fluid off, you basically got a coin rattling around in a box, and that is obviously going to increase the chance of brain damage, brain bleeds, and so on and so forth. But at the very least, it will drain your energy, and it will take away your punch resistance, because you're walking around like you've got an eating disorder. You've seen people with these eating disorders. They do look, I'm almost tempted to say closer to death than life, I mean, if you ever see someone who's anorexia nervosa has taken them down to 6 or 7 stone, they look like they're only a few steps away from death. And whereas Eubank Jr., that may not be that extreme. I mean, he may aesthetically look the part when he gets on the scales at 160, but it doesn't necessarily follow that's his optimum weight. That is a healthy weight for him, never mind a healthy fighting weight. So what can we expect in the rematch? Well, how much time has passed? It's not that much time. I would say my initial reaction is I expect another Smith win. I picked Smith to win the first fight, but on points, not on knockout. Can he stop him again? It's perfectly feasible. Can Eubank Jr. beat Liam Smith in the rematch? Yeah, of course he can, you know. But has he got the energy at 160, the resilience, the sort of physical fortitude? I think he's still mentally very strong, but the physical resilience to go 36 minutes of fighting against someone of that skill who's got a bit of spite, because Liam Smith is a spiteful fighter and he can fight dirty. No, I think Eubank Jr. is up against it, and I think Smith will probably win the rematch. I'll do a proper preview video, but yeah, I think in the press conference today, Smith was sort of, oh, you know, do we have to talk about this? It's so obvious I beat you fair and square. It's so obvious I won and the referee gave you every chance. You just got beaten, mate. And I think Eubank Jr. was sort of clutching at straws somewhat and trying to accentuate the positive and trying to downplay ultimately what happened in the first fight. And he did say it's up to me to rectify what I did wrong and make sure it doesn't happen again. Can he make sure it doesn't happen again? I do have my doubts. Let's put it that way. So what did you think of this press conference? Did you see it? What do you think about the fight itself? Who do you think is going to win? Maybe initially you're thinking, oh yeah, definitely Smith again. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because we make these sort of presumptions, and then as it gets close to the fight, you know, we sometimes maybe we second guess ourselves, or something happens, or we see some training footage. That's always interesting. But let me know, you know, your initial reactions, and tell me what you think. Leave a comment below, of course. As always, I love reading your comments. Thanks for supporting the channel, as always. Spread the word about Joe Stunner Boxing. If you could subscribe if you're new, that would be fantastic. And like the video as well. If you hit that like button, that helps us out as well. So thanks a lot for your time. We'll speak again soon. And of course, bye for now.